Welcome. This is an important topic we're here to discuss today. Finding the path for meeting the world's energy needs while maintaining a sustainable environmental quality is perhaps the central challenge we're facing in the world. With such an important topic in front of us, we're quite fortunate to have a distinguished faculty panel to lead off our discussion. I could spend the next half an hour trying to summarize all their accomplishments and recognitions in research and teaching, but I think we'd rather spend our time talking about energy. So I will briefly introduce John Milak, professor at the Bren School, teaches environmental biogeochemistry, among other things. Is closest to me in the middle is Professor Sang-Won Soo, teaches corporate environmental management, industrial ecology, and life cycle assessment. And finally, furthest from me is Charlie Kolstadt, who teaches environmental economics. After the panelist opening remarks, we'll have an opportunity to take questions from you, our audience. The students on the Dean's Advisory Council asked the panelists to address the following questions in their opening remarks. Alternatives to fossil fuels have been slow to gain significant traction in the United States, and despite recent heavy investment in renewable energy in countries such as Japan, China, Germany, and Switzerland, renewables currently represent a nominal fraction of total world energy generation, and use of fossil fuels, especially coal, is rapidly increasing in India and China. Aspirational goals for the use of more renewables at some point in the future do not seem to be sufficient to address rapidly rising greenhouse gas emissions, and current GHG trends are tracking worst-case IPCC projections. Given all of this, and in light of the ongoing debates of ongoing global economic, security, and governance issues, what do you believe to be the most achievable and effective path forwards in terms of achieving energy sustainability in meaningful timeframes? I'll invite John to begin the discussion.
It's a good question. It's also one that, of course, has many different kinds of answers. So I'm going to give one piece of an answer. At least in the context of the United States, it seems to me that the way we affect political change, which then leads to other kinds of changes, really starts at the local level, or at least the regional level, and then representatives in national and state governments then respond to the citizens in various ways. So, with that sort of perspective, I'll give you a local example of. Although one could argue that the problem is too big, we can't deal with it on a local level. I mean, I think things start at a local level, at least they can. And I'll give you this as somewhat of an anecdote, but I think a useful one. Here in Santa Barbara County, we have a variety of environmental NGOs. One in particular that I'm associated with is called the Community Environmental Council. And about 6 years ago, they decided to try to, in a sense, somewhat brashly wean Santa Barbara County and the neighboring counties off of the use of fossil fuels. And in the process of trying to do that, they took a multifaceted approach, trying to modify building codes, encourage alternative energy sources. And obviously, this has been, a big challenge. But I think it's an example of what can happen at a local level. The Santa Barbara City Council, for example, has now building codes that are stricter than the Title 24 state requirements. Buildings are clearly a major sink for energy use. We have locally a number of wind projects and solar projects which are developing. And even if you read the local newspaper this morning, there was an editorial arguing we need to encourage our exploitation of fossil fuel reserves to improve our tax base. So we have these debates at all levels, and at the local level, we as citizens can maybe affect the change. We can talk to our neighbors. We can discuss the relative trade-offs of what wind farms might mean. We have, in the Bren School and as an associate, an organization that is exploring energy in the ocean, tidal energy, wave energy. So I guess my message is that from a local level, regional level, we can affect change and eventually affect the political process, and have examples of economic benefits to an economy that show positive signs. It's only, of course, a drop in the bucket in one sense, but again, I would argue that in democracies, things start with the citizens, typically not with the so-called leaders in Washington, who they respond to us more than the opposite.
Can I go ahead? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to just start by saying that, well, to me, I think a renewable energy, increasing the production of energy from renewables is one of the many options that we have on the table. It's not the absolute goal that we have here. And I prepared a couple of slides, if I may. I would like to go over. No, I think it's over there. So we'll be very brief. So when you talk about the renewables, and we always seem to talk about the case of Germany as a good example, how they increase their renewable energy in their portfolio. Germany is now producing about 30. By 2011, they have about 30 gigawatt hour of PV capacity, as an example, which is good for about 50% of their peak load. And in the United States, by 2011, we had only about 4 gigawatt hour of capacity, which is good for only 0.05% of the peak. And the country, Germany, we are talking about is basically in terms of insulation, it's equivalent to like Alaska or Maine, and they have very poor, solar resources, but still they are producing significant amount of PV electricity as compared to we do. So, but it seems like a bad news, but in a way there is a good news there, which is that we are no less rational than Germans. Because if we look at household electricity price, we are paying 1/3 of what they are paying, and we are exactly using 3 times more of electricity than German households do. So in a way, we are very rational, and they are also rational. So in terms of total amount of money spent on electricity per household, we are virtually the same. It's an interesting equivalency throughout the world, like a commuting time difference, for instance. Although there are differences in the commuting distance and commuting mode of transportation, but we are spending almost exactly the same amount of time for commuting across the world. So this is that. And but the good news also is that we are changing rapidly. So as we said, well, we have very low electricity price. That kind of incentivize the additional use of electricity from renewables because they are generally more expensive. But we are changing very rapidly. We have added last year significant amount of renewable electricity, and this is only for California. There's significant amount already passing the amount of electricity nationwide produced from renewables by 2011 by California alone. So we are rapidly changing, and I think that there are different views on how this renewable energy future will be looking like in the United States and the rest of the world. But I think much of the question boils down to this. How can we resolve the significant gap between the two words? One very positive word, which is, well, renewable energy future, like NREL's 2012 report, 80% of grid electricity can be supplied by renewables by 2050. We do have technologies, we do have means to do that. But then, well, we have another word which is more closer to the reality where it takes 7 to 10 years for new transmission line to be planned, permitted and then built. It's a significant barrier to significant increase in renewable electricity. And there are other variables and unknowns like how the shale gas and shale oil will be played out in the future. It can be beneficial to renewables. It can be detrimental to renewables. And also there is increasing realization that, well, renewables are coming with their own costs. Not only talking about the biofuels in terms of the liquid biofuels, but also there are trade-offs between increasing renewables with the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Increasing more hydropower, for instance, is virtually impossible in the United States, especially larger ones. And also there is increasing recognition on the materials and energy nexus. So much of the materials that we are using for PV and wind power, like terbium, tellurium, and indium, and gallium, and dysprosium and samarium, all those kind of exotic materials are coming from the countries that we do not call exactly our friends, or their prices are rapidly increasing. So a lot of issues in terms of materials and energy nexus there. So how should we resolve these issues and close the gap between the kind of ideal renewable world versus the reality? I think that is the big question ahead of us. Yep.
Well, that was very useful background information. I have a little bit here, but most of it Sang-Won's gone over. But let me just add a couple of facts to the mixed message that Sang-Won gave at the beginning. And that in fact, I'd like to give a positive spin on this to start with. Looking at the U.S. over the last decade and Germany over the last decade, and I'm going up to 2010 because that's the latest data that I was able to put my hands on. The U.S. has about the same amount of renewable capacity as Germany, which sounds good. Of course, Germany's a much smaller country than the U.S., but another positive thing to look at is that if you go back to 2000, the percentage of the German electricity capacity was 7% renewables at that point, and the U.S. was 2%. So Germany was a lead then, but it wasn't a very big number. And if you fast forward to 2010, Germany increased that to 33%. That is quite an accomplishment. The U.S. also increased its from 2% to over 5%. So Germany certainly deserves a pat on the back for achieving what it's achieved. The U.S. has had a lot of gains over the last decade, not as much as Germany. Two other countries were mentioned, Japan and Switzerland. They really haven't done a whole lot in renewables. The Swiss are up to 2.5%, 3%, same with Japan. So they're quite a bit behind Germany and the U.S. But I also noted in Der Spiegel that apparently the Germans are having to raise what they call the green surcharge on electricity to 10 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, and they're expecting a lot of political pushback on that. If you recall Sang-Won's figure of the cost of electricity in the U.S., which is not the same as the cost here in California, it's a lot more expensive here, but the cost in the U.S. I think was 11 cents a kilowatt hour. So they're talking about a 10 cent a kilowatt hour surcharge to pay for the green electricity. So the message is from Germany that you can achieve a lot in a decade, but it won't come free or without political pushback. Now, all of us may consider 10 cent a kilowatt hour to be fine, but some people, particularly in colder climates and that are not as well off in the U.S., may consider, this may be another Tea Party rallying cry. To try to pay for it in that way. So that's a mixed message. We're making a lot of progress on renewables. Germany certainly is somebody to look forward to. Ironically, the big reason they've been successful is in adopting an idea that we introduced in the U.S. here in the 1970s, that it's the feed-in tariff. That was a big issue in the late 70s and 1980s, allowing people to generate their own electricity and feed it into the grid. But we abandoned that in the 90s. Germany picked it up, improved it, and it's responsible for a lot of what you see. But my last remark in this round on renewables is that let's ask what it is that we want from renewables. Is it that we like the feeling of not burning fossil fuel? Is it that we like the windmills sitting up on top of Camino Cielo along here in a big row, making a nice pattern on the horizon? The Spanish don't like that at all, and that's the way it is there along the ridges. Do we like the do we like using solar water heating? Do we like diverting crops from food to ethanol? Or do we want, is there a paramount issue getting us off of carbon emissions? Getting us off of carbon emissions is a tangible objective, and that's certainly one that I think is reasonable. But some of the other objectives are a little bit difficult for me to put my hands around. And I think in order to know what kind of policy you want to pursue, it's important to know what our goal is, what our objective is here.
A quick follow-up sort of question more than a comment. So these statistics, you're comparing a country with 300 million people with one that Germany's population is what, 80 million, right? So maybe nice to compare California to Germany, just as an example. So the percentages of renewable use in California now, they're mandated to be about 20%, right? And we're now 17, 18%.
Renewable standards portfolio?
Yeah. So could you just, since you're connected with the AB 432 effort and so forth, could you just give us a little bit of a sort of just scale this down to a little more comparable?
Sure. I've long since stopped carrying numbers in my head since I can go to the web and look them up. But we do have a renewable portfolio standard, and this, of course, is only addressing electricity, because renewables is not just electricity. Electricity is sort of an easy one to get your hands around. Data is readily available. But the low carbon fuel standard that's part of the climate initiative in California really is addressing the use of low carbon fuels in transportation, which is not electricity. But the renewable portfolio standards, and one always wants to be careful in putting too much weight on standards. We've had lots of standards in the past, which more or less are goals. And some of them you accomplish, some of them you don't. And when you don't accomplish them, you go to your politician or whatever in Sacramento and say, we haven't been able to do this. We've tried hard. Please change the law. And they do. So it's a little difficult to say where we're going to go. We can say where we've been, and California is, the U.S. looks much better if California is the representative of the U.S. We haven't raised per capita electricity consumption for 40 years. Remained smack dab where it was in the mid-'70s because of all of the energy efficiency programs we've pursued in the state, plus the fact that a lot of manufacturing's gone to Nevada and elsewhere. Well, the U.S. has changed its manufacturing, composition of manufacturing. And we've got the renewable portfolio standards. Other states have them as well. We're not the only one that has strong renewable portfolio standards. But then you get into the question of whether hydro is renewable, since really it is. It's solar energy. But often people leave it out because it's considered to be sort of cheating, because Hoover Dam is hydro, but it's not the small kind of renewables a lot of people have in mind. I don't have any other numbers. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Before I'll turn to the audience for questions in a moment, so feel free to think of things you'd like to pose to our panelists. Taylor and I will be coming up the aisles on the side to bring you the microphone. So in a moment you can raise your hand and pose questions for our panelists. And as you're working on your questions, I thought I'd pose one to our panelists. And in listening to your opening remarks, there's starting to arise in my mind this question of the sense of scale. And I'm sensitive to Charlie. I think you make a great point. So what are we trying to accomplish with renewable energy? And I'll answer, maybe we can all agree that it's addressing climate change in a justifiable and substantial and worthwhile way. So if it is in the sense of that we're looking for renewable energy and we're looking to solve our energy problems with an eye towards climate change, I'm wondering if you can give me a sense to which your prescriptions can scale to the scope of the problem. So is Germany, if the world or the United States could look more like Germany, would we be, would that get us in the right direction? John, if more local action, such as has occurred here in Santa Barbara, were to occur more nationwide, how would that help us address this climate change problem?
Well, if it's a climate change problem, then we're opening up the scope of solutions beyond renewable energy. And
that's part of my question then, is to scale renewable energy relative to the climate change problem, and are we chasing perhaps are we misdirecting our attention? Or to what extent can we count on renewable energies to help us? To what extent would they contribute?
well, let me just say a few words that a lot of people are relying on technological innovation to get us out of the climate change problem. They're hoping that somebody invents the iPhone of energy supply in the next 5 or 10 years, and that solves all our problem. But if you're and renewables are certainly great. If photovoltaics can be turned into a spray-on technology where you spray your windows with some thin some lacquer that you can see through, plug a few wires in the bottom of the glass pane, and hook it up. That's just terrific, and that it's easy to imagine that happening. With technological innovation. But of course, that was a promise in the early '80s too, and it's been a little over the horizon. I like demand management, not using as much energy. I think there's a lot of opportunities there that are maybe a little easier than coming up with a really cheap PV panel or an invisible windmill. I think we should certainly push on the renewables a lot, and when it works, go for it. I think there's some plans to put some wind power right offshore, so it's not a visual blight, which is great. In really windy places, it should be used, and a lot of progress can be done in that. But we can make progress in decarbonizing our electricity supply, just in getting off of coal. We'll do a lot. Reducing our consumption of electricity, we'll do a lot. Working on transportation, the fuel economy standards that are in law now from the Obama administration will make a tremendous difference if they stay in place over the next couple of decades. So I think pushing on all fronts is really what we have to do, and I don't see a single thing, including a particular renewable technology, as really answering all of our questions, or a lot of them, in climate change.
Yeah, I agree with Charlie's point. I think there should be a lot of many actions in concert can address the climate change issue more effectively. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the comments, renewables is one of the many options that we have as a portfolio, and it comes with its own cost. And depending on the scale of application, areas of application, really, some other options may stand out better than renewables, depending on the different conditions. And we should be also very realistic about what renewables can do in addressing climate change. And PVs, for instance, we think it is a kind of new technology. It is a new technology. It's a rapidly evolving technology. But at the same time, we should realize that PV research has been there for several decades. In the 1970s, we had very lofty hope about the PVs, and of course, the efficiency has improved and the cost went down dramatically. But the speed of innovation in PV, as compared to amount of investment spent, was not as fast as we expected it to be. And those renewable energy technologies are trying to harness very dilute form of energy. So in order to really make a significant difference, we are talking about really huge scale of applications. So for instance, million rooftop PVs are basically just 1% of California's total energy demand, total electricity demand. So 1 million rooftops. So the scale of application that we are talking about in order to make the huge dent in greenhouse gas emissions is enormous. And if we like that path, that's great, but then we should be ready for bearing the cost of it. The NREL's estimate was that, well, by 2050, we can get to 80% of renewable for grid electricity, which is one of the many areas that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But then that entails about 50% increase in our electricity cost. And 50% is just 4 cents, 5 cents per kilowatt hour. It does not sound very much, but many of the businesses who are already suffering from the economic downturn may take it very differently. So the question is, are we as a society ready to bear the cost of renewables? Definitely it will cost more than what we are paying now. Is there a willingness, societal willingness to take that? And political leadership who will take that into forward? And I think that's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, part of this is a timescale question. So, I mean, if we're focused on climate change, a lot of the arguments now are based around the projections about how fast the climate might be changing. There's a whole other suite of arguments that are made regarding how we energize our economy, and they are built around eventually, fossil fuels are going to be expired. If you take a long-term perspective. Also, arguments are made. I mean, burning petroleum is kind of a cool compound. It's used for all kinds of functions, all kinds of plastics, et cetera, et cetera. Burning it up in our cars is kind of throwing away a resource that might be used better other ways. It's a little bit less true now, but it's still obviously a real player. The geopolitical dimension of energy sources. The U.S. now feels, oh, we're great. We've got fracking-based gas. We can avoid. We can be energy independent. That's a fleeting argument, I think. It looks great, right now for the people that are thinking about the next election cycle, but clearly go out very many years and we're not going to be energy independent anymore. So I think how you view the investment cycles, the infrastructure cycles for power is many decades, right? So I guess if you were willing to, and this is a big if, but if you're willing to say that climate change is not the primary or the only driver, there's other factors that we need to bear in mind as an overall society and civilization, then we have time is on our side more so. If climate becomes the critical factor and the effects are really acute, then maybe we're in a different ballgame.
Well, I think time is on our side now for questions from our audience. So we'll have Taylor on this side, and when I come, I'll start and ask the first. I'll have the first question. When I come to you, please give your name and briefly ask your question, and we'll start from Minnesota.
Hi, I'm Matt Burgess. My question is, so other than climate change, it seems like the other big source of concern when it comes to renewable energy is that we're not developing capacity and technology faster than fast enough that to offset how fast we're running out of some of these non-renewable sources. And so my question is, in terms of fuel, electricity, heat, where do you think we're going to feel the most pain, or we should be worried about this the most? So if, for example, it seems like we have a lot of potential to increase our capacity to produce electricity. So if we ran out of coal, maybe that wouldn't be so hard to ramp it up if the economic incentive is no longer there, because presumably the price would go way up. But to what extent is that the case for some of these other areas? In other words, which kind of energy should we be most concerned about?
And just to while the panelists just think about that, we'll ask questions to one panelist at a time, and this will give us a time to hear many questions from the audience. But I think Charlie was preparing to field that one.
You want to do an answer?
Please.
Yeah, personally, I think that the end use where there are least where there's less ability to substitute is the problem area. So that has to be transportation, where we're really tied to liquid fuels, which is a euphemism for oil. And so I think we've seen that before. Electricity is really it's a relatively simple thing to deal with. Lots of stuff. You can burn old tires. You can burn these desks in a power plant and generate electricity from it. But if transportation, and we see it every time the gas price spikes, everybody scrambles. They got all these big vehicles. They don't know what to do with them. You can't just turn down the efficiency. So it's transportation where I think is the big problem area. Personally.
Taylor, do you want to?
Just quickly, I also agree with that, and especially the aviation fuel. I mean, probably road transportation in the midterm more manageable than aviation fuel, but it will be very challenging to replace aviation fuel by any type of renewables.
Oh, hi, I didn't know she'd be holding it. Hi, I'm Todd. I'm curious to know how realistically the prospects for non-renewable energy are going to be affected by the abundance of, how the prospects for renewable energy are going to be affected by the abundance of non-renewable resources in the United States. I mean, you mentioned, Professor Su, the shale gas and shale oil. And I think you said there are scenarios that could play out favorably for non-renewables, or for renewables, and some that wouldn't. And I'm curious if you could elaborate on those scenarios.
So we are working on that. E and Joe is somewhere here. I saw that. Yeah. Okay. So we are working on that for NSF now. So NSF's big concern was that they promoted a lot about renewable energy research, and they put a lot of money, and they talked to the Office of Science and Technology at White House, saying that renewable energy is good because it increases the energy independence and it's clean and all the good kind of things. But then, suddenly the shale gas come online, and it seems that there is a good prospect of having significant amount of shale gas from the United States, so that energy independence idea is not selling very well. So they are very much concerned about what are the implications of shale gas in the future of the renewable energy. But then we looked into some of the literatures, especially my student E did, and it seems that there are two different scenarios possible. One is that because of the fact that those PVs and other renewables are variable energy, which is intermittency built into the energy supply, there is always an issue of storage and making that intermittency more regular over time. And in the past, what we have used was, either storage or the gas power plant that can be easily fired up and produce significant amount of electricity when those power plants, the renewable energy sources are down. So in that sense, providing affordable gas power plant by providing low price gas is actually helpful for deploying renewable energy, variable renewable energy in a significant scale. That's one positive aspect. Of course, the negative aspect is that, what if people just replace everything by natural gas power plant? In the short run, it's much better than coal power plant in terms of greenhouse gases and other pollutants, but in the long run, of course, it's worse than renewable energy in terms of greenhouse gases and other aspects. So I think there is some fine line in between the good and bad scenarios in that sense.
Thank you, Todd and Sang-Wan.
Can I just add one comment? That if I had one word to send you off into your future for, it's storage. If you can solve the storage problem, you've solved all of these problems. Yeah. Electric cars will be a piece of cake with storage. Solar, it doesn't matter if it shines, the sun shines in the daytime or not. With storage, storage is the answer to all our problems.
The Bren students are now in the position of Dustin Hoffman, but in place of plastics, we have storage.
My name is Sheetal, and I want to ask you, actually go back to one of the last points that you made, Charlie, what about behavior? I mean, one part of energy problem is new technological innovation, and the other part, I feel, is actually consumer behavior and almost political ideology or even philosophy, because we all have multiple gadgets doing the same thing. We have multiple, it's almost opulence that is not necessary in our behavior, and that causes more production, which takes more energy. I mean, do we really need to use i4 if we haven't really exhausted the capacity of iPhone 3, or it's things like that, you know. Just if we just control our behavior, and I don't know if I should use the word capitalism, but is that almost easier than just creating the whole new infrastructure and going after faster, better, cheaper business model?
That's a great question, and the behavior side of it is where a lot of economists actually say we should focus. Now I'll come back to what you're talking about with behavior in a second, but people make decisions that govern how much energy they use that are behavioral, not technological. Mm-hmm. You go into the Ford dealer to buy yourself a car, you can choose a really, really efficient car, or you can choose one that isn't so efficient. These are behavioral choices you're making. Where you live is a behavioral choice. A lot of things you do are behavioral choices. Now, I think you were taking it maybe a step further and saying that lifestyles need to be changed, so that instead of the opulence that we have, possibly, or some of us have, that we should go back to trying to find the right word without sounding pejorative, but go back to a simple life. And I think that a lot of people hope for that, but usually they're hoping that other people will do the simple life rather than themselves. But just, I think, though, the point is a really good one, though, that behavior, maybe not in really the idea of going back to simplicity, but changing behavior, but particularly giving people incentives to change behavior. If you go into the Ford dealer and gas has been kept artificially low so that, why don't I buy this big vehicle? I can fit all my kids in it, plus all their friends. But if the price of petrol is high, or gas is high, then that behavioral decision will go in a different direction. So we've got to send people signals to let their behavior, move their behavior in a different direction. So I'm totally with you. Behavior is really much more effective than just inventing a Suburban that gets 50 miles to the gallon.
Yeah, we got questions from you by email, but what this is related to in a way, and just to take a slightly different spin than what Charlie said, I mean, part of the issues are aspirational in other parts of the world. I mean, we were sort of responded in terms of like the U.S. or Western Europe, but and some of you are from China. If you've visited China recently, I mean, there's been a huge transformation of the economy of China in terms of transportation is one really glaring example. I mean, there's a behavioral change caused by a policy change in a central government that has huge implications globally. But you can't sit here in the U.S. and say, well, that should never have happened, because you're imposing an ethical position and a resource use position on another country. So I think it's a very complicated ethical, cultural question. when you look at at a global scale, one of the other questions was about, well, are there leapfrog technologies that might work in East Africa, or other parts of Africa? Like people say cell phones have leapfrogged communication and banking. That's true. It's a much harder thing to do with energy. I mean, you can make examples. I mean, like we have in our Energy Efficiency Institute, they're providing a solar-powered light source, which at an incremental level helps people in parts of the world where there's no electricity grid. It's safer than kerosene. It provides light for improving education. Those are important steps, but I think it's very different to leapfrog an energy technology than it is to leapfrog a communication technology. So I think when we address these issues of behavior, I think we have to take a global view as well as a local view.
Can I comment on that aspect? Yeah, this is, I think, very interesting and important issue. I think I also agree with both that behavioral issues is very important and probably we can harness more from it with the assumption that we change something about the framework condition, not through education. So I will elaborate on that a little more. So as we have seen in the German case, part of us is homo economicus, right? I mean, we are not always making rational decisions, but it seems that if we look at the statistical point of view, I mean, it seems that we are quite rational in making decisions. So about the iPhone example, we will not change our iPhone so rapidly if iPhones are like $20,000, right? It's fairly affordable as compared to our income level, and additional benefits, sounds to us quite attractive to spend that money. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a guest speaker from Mr. Lovelock. He talked about the importance of frugality. And he reminded us that when the aluminum cooking foils were first invented, people loved it, but then, well, people wiped it out and use it again and again. These days, we just tear it off and then use it and then we just dispose of it. Well, but there is a reason for that because aluminum foil at that time were much more expensive as compared to what is it now in real price basis. So there is a good reason why we want to dispose of it because if we don't want to clean that up, it's labor costs and all inconvenience. It does not make sense because it's so dirt cheap. So in a way, we are making rational decisions based on our means that we have and based on the affordability that we have. So if we change the framework condition under which we as a homo economicus can behave differently, I think there is good ways in which we can leverage upon our behavioral choices. In the past, there has been effort to use education and cultural awareness, those kind of things, to change behavior. I'm all for that. However, it has, I think, historically has very limited success. For instance, one good example is about lead paint. People used lead paint until 1970s, I believe, and then there was huge education campaign not to touch your paint and put it into your mouth, things like that, for kids, and it didn't work. It didn't really reduce any of the exposure level of lead to children. But what really changed the lead exposure was banning lead paint. There was much more effective ways in which we can reduce the lead paint. So I think behavioral issues, in a way, well, if we change the framework condition in right way, it would be great, but in other ways, it might be quite difficult to achieve.
Hello, my name is Bren, coming from Germany. I just quickly want to add a few remarks on the discussion because that is quite interesting to me. And I want to quickly add that the cultural dimension is extremely important and strongly influences the respective framework conditions in a country. I mean, as you nicely, you gave the numbers someone, and in fact, I mean, our electricity costs are relatively high. But I would say that the strongest driver for the renewables is not even climate change, but energy independency. So we highly rely on imports, mostly from Russian countries. Russia, we have very little natural gas in Germany. And that is probably the strongest driver to bring us closer to a relatively high percentage of renewables. The other point is, though, that we have a relatively strong commitment from society and policymakers to achieve this goal, and this for more than 2 decades now. And that was even surprising to me, that even over changes of government, various governments, the laws were put into place and remained in place. And that brings me to my last point, that most important, I think, for economy and society are stable framework conditions and predictability of these framework conditions. Because, I mean, we are also a highly industrialized country, and of course we have the same discussions going on like in the US, so when prices go up, that will affect first consumers, then industry. But what we saw over the last decades is, with the stability in the price increase, major investments in industry and the energy sector were made. And that, again, brings the cost down over the longer run and creates that stability that you need to make these investments. And I think with the stability, again, you can also invest more into research and technology development. I mean, years ago we would say it is impossible to have more than 20% of wind energy in the grid. We see now in Denmark, a relatively small country of course, but we see more than 30% in the grid. So a lot of things are possible once the decisions are made and major investments are made.
Let me ask you a question, actually. No, in the context of what you just said, I think it's follows. So the recent change in policy in Germany toward nuclear energy, driven by the catastrophes in Japan, largely, I understand, has now created a conundrum for the country, because now you have lots of coal. It's not very nice coal. It's soft coal, and yet you have it. And so you make a political decision based on a totally different set of criteria, i.e. the safety of these nuclear power plants, and now you're pushing the economy to use more coal. How do you, so in a sense, even though the government is stable and everything, the laws work and all that kind of thing, there's a shock to the system in a sense, an external shock, which leads to a significant policy change, which has pretty big ramifications. I mean, I know this is a hard question to answer, but do you have any thoughts on that dimension of how we respond to these sort of external perturbations, so to speak?
Yeah, thoughts, yes. I don't have an answer. And I was often asked this question, and I think it's very difficult to understand, looking from abroad to Germany, why those decisions were made. A professor recently asked me here, so you have many more casualties from coal burning plants than from nuclear power plants. So why did you decide on this? And I can only say it's a long history, going back to '86 with a big incident in Russia. And we have a very high awareness on this. Politically, it's not achievable to come up with power plants anymore, not with new power plants, and our older power plants are pretty old. So they will soon go out of business. And yeah, it's a tricky discussion. It's also tricky because at this very moment we get a lot of nuclear power from France. So the question is, do we really want to replace German nuclear power by French nuclear power? Which is, and then the next question, of course, is what do we do with our coal? We have still high coal resources, but as you pointed out, it's pretty bad coal. It's not solved yet, I can only say. It's an ongoing discussion. Hopefully, the increase in renewable power will be able to make up for the lack of nuclear power that we have at the moment. At this very moment, I would say it looks pretty good. We could achieve it, yeah.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
I want to ask you a question to Professor Su, and have you done any life cycle assessment about fracking? Because which is the shale gas that you're just talking about is a very important alternative energy for the future, and China has a very big storage of fracking, but the technology is not good enough to extract it out. So what would you say about the environmental impact about the fracking according to the experience of United States?
Good question. I think we are getting to understand more about the the environmental implications of fracking. I mean, when I'm talking about direct environmental implication, not the indirect ones, like whether it will be helpful for renewables to grow or it will not be helpful for renewables to grow. But there are a lot of unknowns there, to my understanding. It seems that the University of Texas in Austin, they are working on the possible methane gas emissions from fracking technologies. And it's, my understanding is they are, the kind of chemicals that they are using may not be the most friendly chemical to Earth, but at this point, we do not have the full understanding on the environmental implications of fracking technology. I think it will be coming probably in the near future. But I wanted to, unless you want, yeah.
Yeah, may I answer that?
Yeah.
In addition, so, there's a lot of issues that, some of which I think are bogus about the negative effects, some of which are possible. But a couple that really come to mind that I think the evidence is stronger is because some subset of the water that's being used for the fracking process comes to the surface, it's not re-injected, you end up storing water that is of very poor environmental quality. Mm-hmm. So in the case of China, I mean, you have a distribution across the country of lack of water in a large fraction of the country and adequate water in other parts. So the issue of surface water contamination is an issue here. I think it's an incipient issue that China will have to face. So that's a direct, I think there's no question that surface contamination of water will increase because of fracking, unless the companies invest an immense amount of money in reverse osmosis systems, which make it economically very expensive now. The other more esoteric part of the whole issue is how much methane gas escapes during the process of fracking. And we're going back and forth on this. The evidence, the most recent evidence I've seen in this country is that there's actually more release than people want to admit. And as those of you that know about the carbon cycle realize, this methane on a short-term scale is a more potent greenhouse gas, has greater warming potential. If you're focused purely on the greenhouse gas warming aspect of fracking, it is true we're burning a cleaner fuel, but if we're releasing directly into the atmosphere increasing amounts of methane, it's a second order effect which needs better attention. And there I think the technology could be improved to release less. But from my point of view, the biggest challenge is the use of water in general and the potential contamination of surface waters. Not the groundwater, deep water contamination. That's potential in some small number of cases, but the real danger is the surface water impoundment of contaminated water.
I would like to have just quick clarification to the previous comment. Is that okay? So going back to Severin, I totally agree with you, and I think my comments on the limited success on the education was, well, we cannot teach frugality, and we had in the past very limited success on those kind of things. But definitely there is a cultural and societal commitment that really enables significant changes like this. And there were a lot of comments about the Germans' decision on wiping out nuclear power after the Fukushima event. But talking to some of the people that I know of that is very engaged with the German politicians, this discussion has been 2 decades old discussion. It has been the commitment by the society and politicians made throughout the 2 decades, so there were no surprises when this decision was made. Of course, probably the decision was announced a little earlier than was planned, but basically this was in line with the long-term discussion and societal commitment to that end after Chernobyl, basically.
Well, this has certainly been an interesting and stimulating discussion. It's clear that I think that if we're looking for a single bullet solution to the renewable energy challenge, there probably isn't one. But certainly there's a lot of fodder here to think there are things that can be done to make real and important improvements. I'd like to thank our panelists, John Milax, Sangwon Su, and Charlie Kolstad for their thorough and thoughtful remarks. And I'd like to thank the students on the Dean's Advisory Council here at the Bren School, Bren White, Brianna Shippey, Derek Wiggum, and Taylor DeBevic. Thank you for your attentions and your comments, and have a good afternoon.